Just a quick disclaimer before we kick the video off. Given the nature of my channel and my interest, I have a bias toward the swords, so I keep referring to the Missaglia family and the other protagonists of this video as sword makers. However, they were mostly known as armor makers, so just keep that in mind when watching the video.
I've recently been looking into sword makers from the Middle Ages, and specifically from the area of Milan. Milan, as you may know, was a huge center for the production and export of high-quality arms and armor for a long period of time, and specifically what I'm looking at now is kind of in the late Middle Ages. And while reading through papers, books, and old editions of like Milanese archives, historical archives, I found an interesting article that I thought I would share with you. I'll of course link it in the description, but the article is in Italian, so there may be some language barrier there if you're wanting to read it. So whether you choose to read the article or not, you'll at least get a gist in English of what the context was in Milan in the first half of the 1400s around sword production, marking, kind of trademark law, early trademark law in a sense, and the litigation that came with forgery of marks. And there are specifically two legal cases which are recorded in Milanese archives, which have to do with kind of litigation between sword makers for the right to use a specific mark or another. So the things I'm saying in this video, I owe very much to the article by Eugenio La Rosa, which is linked in the description. And it's also mentioned, by the way, in a paper by Marco Merlo, again, a paper about sword markings in the Milanese area. So let's get into it. So by the beginning of the 1400s, we're already in full swing in Europe in an era of modernization and renovation and reform in a sense. And this is basically the convergence of a whole bunch of different factors. We have the development of the comuni in Italy, so these free autonomous cities which kind of regulate themselves with a aristocratic, oligarchic kind of government, but which starts having input from classes that previously were not as well represented. The fact that we have a rich class of merchants that can lead these comuni in many cases is also the consequence, of course, of a boom in manufacturing and trade, big surplus in terms of agricultural production. So it's in general a very booming time. And we're also, it's already happened a couple of centuries earlier, but we're still kind of reaping the consequences, in a sense, of the rediscovery of Roman law and the rethinking of law, which kind of modernizes but also plugs onto the very solid framework of Roman law. And then, through the diffusion of universities, which at this point have been opening all across Europe, spreads the legal concepts and frameworks all across Europe. At the center of this whole framework, in a sense, we have notaries. These are the professional figures that are tasked with certifying all kinds of transactions, kind of in the same way as things happen today. The notary would essentially certify that a transaction had happened. In most cases, of course, these transactions aren't buying some bread or buying a piece of cloth, but they had to do with transfers of inheritance or with real estate purchase, land purchase. But in many cases, they also recorded and certified the transcripts of court cases, for example, of legal litigation, essentially. So what we have here is a medieval world, in a sense, that is kind of looking forward into the modern age, in a sense. And this is really important to understand the context in which these two snippets of history we're going to talk about happens. So as you probably know, a lot of swords were marked. And markings went from religious markings to mottos, but in many cases they are maker's marks. To us, in often cases, these marks look like something arcane and hard to interpret. Even when you buy or have access to specialized books, you'll often see these just as tables with lists of marks that sometimes have big differences, but sometimes seem like many variations of a similar mark. You may have a head under a crown, you may have letters under a crown, you may have all kinds of different marks. The most common you can imagine probably is the Passau Wolf, which most sword collectors will be familiar with, but there are, of course, many, many more. And here is already a first difference between the way we perceive these marks today and how they were probably perceived in the past. We see them today as something that needs to be interpreted and deciphered, and often we cannot do that because maybe the mark is unclear or we don't have records anymore of who that mark can be attributed to. In medieval times, on the other hand, these marks in many cases would have been really, really famous and really, really recognizable. I'm not going to say to the level of a modern trademark or kind of company logo, that's probably going a little too far, but Definitely not in the kind of esoteric interpretation way, but way more immediately recognizable than we are able to do today. So just to give one example, for instance, the Missaglia family, which was one of the big sword-making families in Milan, had their home, which for centuries was basically workshop and home for a long time. This home was demolished, I think, in the early 1900s, 1914 if I'm not mistaken. And the sword maker's mark of this family, the one that you would have found on the swords, was carved in many stones and, was very prominent on the building itself. This means that these symbols would have been essentially an early version of what we see as a trademark today. And the parallel with the trademark isn't just in the fact that it would have been recognized, probably not by anyone, but let's say by anyone who needed to know what those marks were, but also in the fact that we do have cases of litigation about marks, about forgery, or about marks that share a few two similarities. Now, forgery is nothing new. We know that marks, for example, like Andrea Ferrara, or one of the various different variations of it, are not always attributable to Ferrara. We know that the Passau Wolf was replicated in Solingen, for example, and I mean, there are countless examples of this. What we often, I think, don't connect in terms of building an accurate picture of the world of the past is that when these forgeries were found out, or in the case that they were able to be proven, there were consequences for this. And this is because the mark, in a sense, acts as a branding and, in a certain sense, as a sign of quality. When you see a wolf, for example, or what you think is a Passau wolf, you may assume that that blade comes from a high-quality bladesmith. And this, of course, happens not only with the marks that relate to areas of production, like the Passau wolf, for example, but also to marks that relate to specific families or specific individuals making swords. So when you see the Missaglia mark, for example, you will expect that that blade is indeed made by one of the top bladesmiths of Milan, and not perhaps by one of the average guys, or worse, an apprentice, or someone who doesn't know really what they're doing. There's another reason too why these marks are really important, and this has to do with traceability in a sense. So by this time, the comuni are controlling, in many cases, the export, at least, and production of goods. And while they can't control it in a fully centralized manner, they at least want to be sure that weapons that are produced in the city are traceable. One, because of reasons of quality assurance, for example. They want to ensure that what comes out of those highly regarded production facilities within the city walls are marked in a way that they can earn that premium that foreign buyers will pay. But in many cases, it also has to do with avoiding that weapons produced in the city are sold, for instance, or provided to enemy cities. This is especially true in Italy, for instance, where the fragmentation of small comuni, each one governing independently, really leads to a long period of small but also large conflict among cities who are often neighbors. So to paint a picture, we have this booming economy across Europe. We have bustling cities in which new classes of citizens, like rich merchants and highly skilled craftsmen, are producing and then trading all across the continent their high quality goods. And of course, we also have this new legal framework which tends to start controlling a lot of the production, the export, the way goods are transferred and managed, and tends to record everything through the figure of notaries. And the notary is the first person we encounter in the stories we're going to talk about today. This is Enrichino da Sartorana, who on the 9th of April 1429, if I'm not mistaken, transcribes the details of an appeal to a sentence that was passed by a judge in the case brought by Aloisio da Boltego, which was a swordmaker, against Dionisio Negroni, which is another swordmaker, both from Milan. And I'll attempt a quick translation of the passage La Rosa quotes here in his article. Essentially, Aloisio had started this litigation because Dionisio, since a while, was marking his armors with a mark that was exactly the same as the one he, Aloisio, had already used. And before him, Aloisio, for over 25 years, had been used by Aloisio's father, Cristoforo da Boltego. So Aloisio is essentially noticing or finds out that Dionisio is reproducing exactly, so a complete forgery of his mark, and he can bring proof that he's been using this mark for a while, and not only that, but that the mark had been used by his father for over 20 years before. Unfortunately, legal documents of the time didn't always survive in their complete entirety, so we do not have information about what kind of defense, if any, Dionisio brought for the reason why he was forging this mark. What the author La Rosa suggests here is that he probably will have claimed that with no rules or regulations within the guild regarding registration of marks or trademarks, there was nothing really in the way of him using this mark. So the assumption is that Dionisio would have simply said, well, there's no rule against me not using this mark, so why should I be punished for it? But that's not the only complaint Aloisio has, because he also has to say that even a second mark, which, to his saying, had been used by him for longer than Negroni had, so longer than Dionisio had, was, if not a perfect counterfeit, similar enough imitation to induce confusion. So whereas the first was a complete forgery, this would have been a little bit like, I don't know, imagine Supreme and someone having Serene with the same font and the same colors, let's say, something like that. So similar enough to cause confusion, but not exactly the same. Again, we don't have the reply here of Dionisio Negroni. So again, the author La Rosa suggests what he thinks could be a realistic reply that Dionisio would have given. And it is that essentially these marks are not the same, and that by examining them, there should be sufficient, there are sufficient elements of difference that set them aside. So we have the complaints, we don't have the defense statement, but we do have the judge's rulings. And in the first case, in the first complaint, the one of pure forgery, he actually agrees with Aloisio and forbids Dionisio from using that mark sub pena falsi. This means essentially that there is the risk, if he continues doing this, of the crime being judged as falso. I don't know the legal details of it, but essentially it's like lying or saying something false or forgery. And this is not a small issue, because the consequence for the crime for being found guilty of falso is losing a hand. So Dionisio is kind of getting away with a warning in this case, but he better not be found out again forging the mark of Aloisio. However, on the second matter, he does not accept Aloisio's point and decides that while there is definitely a resemblance between the marks, there is not sufficient resemblance for Dionisio to be forbid from using his variant. So a little bit of a bittersweet ending for Aloisio. He's only half right in his complaints, but not to worry. After a few years, I think 4 years later, we have records of actually Dionisio and Aloisio creating a business together. So things seem to be very fluid, and overall the conflict was solved a few years later. Now for the second case, we have to refer to another notary's records, Ambrogio Spanzotta. And on the 7th of November, again, if I'm not mistaken, 1433, so 4 years later, he's also dealing with a similar litigation. And this is between two sword makers called Bernardo Solari and Bernardo Calvi, and they're in litigation with another member of the Negroni family, Tommaso. And Tommaso, if I'm not mistaken, is actually the brother of Dionisio, which is the defendant we saw in the previous case. But the roles are now reversed, and the family of the previous defendant is actually now bringing a case against the two Bernardos. And it's again for the same reason. It's for forging their unique trademark, essentially. In this case, though, we see a stark difference in terms of the judge's ruling, because the two Bernardos have to promise or are made to not use any mark that has even a passing semblance to the one of Tommaso. Overall, it has to be said that the marks that are reported in these cases are all very similar. They are a typical overall mark of Milanese sword makers. You have a cross at the apex and two diverging lines, almost like a triangle. And then underneath these lines, either at the end points of the diverging lines or in between them, you have some initials. There are a number of variations. The position of the letters could be different. Instead of a cross, there could be a crown, if I'm not mistaken. But essentially, they were very similar. What we can essentially deduce, I guess, from this is that litigation at the time was already happening at a rather refined level of trademark law. It's anachronistic to call it trademark law, but conveys the message. What we're talking about here isn't just the fact that, hey, that guy is using a wolf that vaguely looks like what we use. It literally has to do with the small minutiae of the mark itself, a little bit like we would see in the modern world today. And what's also interesting, I think, is how the judges' rulings seem to show that there isn't really a standard in this. In the first case, we have a judge that says, I will not tolerate marks that are exactly the same, even though there's no rule against it, but I will tolerate marks that are similar but not the same. Whereas in the second case, just 4 years later, maybe with another judge, we have a ruling that says, no, things cannot even be passingly similar. You have to completely make your mark unique. So why are these rulings so different? That's something we don't really know, in the sense that I don't have that much knowledge of the Milanese legal framework in the 1400s to be able to finally draw a conclusion on this. But I suppose we can speculate a little. And I think two things we could hypothesize are, one, that different judges simply interpreted the law in a different way. Another reason of speculation, perhaps, is that in the second case, we're talking about Tommaso Negroni. His nickname was Missaglia, and Missaglia is the beginner of a family of very distinguished sword makers in Milanese history. You could say probably some of the apex producers of arms and armor in Milan at the time. So perhaps it can even be that in Missaglia's case, he brought enough weight to the table that the judge considered that while between, let's say, average sword makers, we may not really care about the small variations and just make sure you don't copy each other, in the case of someone imitating Missaglia, and perhaps in the context we discussed before of Milan exporting high volume of weapons to high-profile clients across Europe, the risk of having lower quality products marked in a way that may induce people to think that they were made by Missaglia was a risk that the government of Milan or the institutions of Milan were not willing to take. I don't know which one of these is true. It's possible that there's another explanation as well, but I'll just leave you with these two hypotheses. One last point, which La Rosa mentions in his article, and I think is really important for sword collectors or sword students, is how crucial it is to, when possible, dive into these small details and minutiae that may feel separate from your field of interest because it doesn't have to do directly with a blade or with a sword, but it can actually provide really important information. Because the first case, the one from 1429, shows the markings of the two litigants, but it also mentions how this mark was used already previously by Aloisio's father at least 30 years earlier, so around the turn of the century. This means that the sword scholar can now be way more precise and not simply look at the cross with two lines and letters as a Milanese symbol from, let's say, the late Middle Ages, but we can now determine certain variations of it and attribute them to specific people. And moreover, we can also look at the fact that Aloisio mentioned his father was using this mark at least 25 years before, and this means that we can now date that mark to 25 years or a little more than 25 years before what we previously thought we could. This may seem like a small win, but from the perspective of the modern sword collector or sword enthusiast, for whom information is often really fragmentary and hard to come by and hard to really compile in a complete overview as we're used to maybe in more modern times, this is really, really important information. And I think it opens a window on the kind of work military historians or historians of antique weapons are doing and kind of these little gaps that they fill to make our life a little bit easier. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm planning actually to do a bunch more of these because I've been diving a lot into of the time and into papers and things that in many cases are in Italian, so they may not be accessible to the English-speaking community. So if you think this is interesting and you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe and support the channel in any way, because that way I'll be able to talk way more about these little intricacies and little anecdotes, perhaps, of the past. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon in another sword video. Bye! And of course, a huge thanks to Eugenio La Rosa and Marco Merlo, because without their work, I wouldn't have much to talk about in this video.